welcome to this short podcast on a research article that's just been published in the British Journal of Radiology. I'm Heidi Probst, and I'm just going to introduce the session today. So the article that we're looking at is titled A Randomised Controlled Trial Evaluating Fluorescent Ink versus Dark Ink Tattoos for Breast Radiotherapy. And the authors are Stephen Landegg et al. From the Royal Marsden Hospital. So I'm Heidi Probst, and I'm a Professor of Radiotherapy and Oncology here at Sheffield Hallam University. So I've got a few of my colleagues with me in the room today, and I think we might just go around the room actually, and they're going to just briefly introduce themselves so that you know who's here. Kath, would you mind?
Yeah, I'm Kath Holborn, and I'm one of the senior lecturers in Radiotherapy and Oncology at Sheffield Hallam.
Hi, I'm Alex Robinson, and I'm one of the lecturers here at Sheffield Hallam U.
Hi, I'm Amy Taylor. I'm one of the senior lecturers here and also a research superintendent at Weston Park.
Hi, I'm Sharon Labour, and I'm a student doing radiotherapy oncology.
Great, thank you. So you know who's in the room. I'm going to do a very short summary of this article, just in case you haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's pretty new. It's only come out, and it's available online. It's open access, available from the British Institute of Radiology website for the BJR. So you can download it there. So this study is a randomised controlled trial looking particularly at the use of ultraviolet fluorescent ink for tattoo marking versus traditional dark ink for women who are having breast radiotherapy. They used a non-blinded, it's a single centre study, parallel group design. Women were randomised to either receive the UV tattoos or the traditional dark ink tattoos. So they randomised 46 patients and they measured random and systematic error. That was their primary outcome measure, was to look at reproducibility with the UV tattoos versus the standard tattooing ink. But they also looked at treatment times, setup times, planning times, which is obviously important given the patient group. And they also looked at impact on body image for the patients studied. So that's the brief overview of the study. Hopefully you'll be able to read the article in full. What I've used, or sometimes what we recommend for students, is helpful to use a critical appraisal tool when doing evaluating research articles, and I've just used the assigned checklists. If you've not come across them before, I mean, there are lots of checklists out there to choose from. I just particularly like the SIGN ones, and that stands for the Scottish Institute for Guidelines Network. So if you just Google that, you can come across, they have a whole load of resources, and they have a checklist for different types of research methods, and they have one particularly for controlled trials. So I'll be using that as a guide as we go through the discussion this morning, just to make sure we haven't missed anything important. So having covered a very brief overview of the study, I'm just going to open the floor to my colleagues here now, just so that we can have a discussion about what we think were the positives and negatives of this study. Does anybody here want to start? I can start. So I think one of the positive aspects of this particular piece of work is that it's an area where in the past there has been very little choice for patients. There has always been simply a case of patients almost have to have tattoos because there hasn't been anything else as an alternative. And the authors in the background section identify some of the clear problems with using permanent ink tattoos, that they cause to a cosmetic outcome, to lack of patient choice. They also mention sort of body image concerns, and the fact that actually there are some religious and sort of cultural issues that for some patients it may go against some of their beliefs. So I think there's a real clear rationale for undertaking the study and trying to look at some alternatives for patients. Does anybody else have anything?
I'd have to agree with the comments you've made so far. That it's a really important area that generally is overlooked maybe by radiographers. Obviously they are small, tiny little tattoo marks, but nevertheless that is a permanent record on our patients. So it's a really interesting area that they've chosen to look at.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even though there's very little data out there about patients' experiences of tattoos, but I know from patient reports from my own research that we've done over the years that actually there is a proportion of patients that don't like tattoos. Some women don't mind them, but there is a proportion of women who really don't like them and don't like the permanency of being reminded of their cancer experience and their cancer treatment.
I think it's that control issue as well of not having a choice.
I think you're absolutely right, yeah. And I know from online forums and some discussions on Twitter that some patients do feel that, and it's the final blow for them sometimes in terms of they've had all that control taken off them when they get their diagnosis and treatment and chemotherapy, etc., and then to find out they've got to have another permanent mark is just a final insult for some women.
There's such variations in practice as well. You know, some centres are doing 3 tattoos, some are doing 5, some are doing 6. You know, when you get into the higher ones for the SCF marking, they are far more visible no matter what clothing you wear. So I think we need to consider that as well.
I think that's a really excellent point, and I think unfortunately there isn't any strong evidence for the rationale for the number of tattoos. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and like you say, it does vary. And as part of the breast radiotherapy interest group, which I chair, we have done a survey of the number of tattoos that different centres use, and it does vary. I think the most common is 3, but again, there is no rationale for centres who use more than that. It's just preference by department, really. So, should we move on to the method that these researchers have used for their study? Does anybody have any comments about the research method?
I felt that, I suppose it links to what we've just been discussing, that in terms of the sample that they looked, sort of the eligibility for the study, I thought it was inclusive criteria, so it was, I thought, good that they included mastectomy patients as well as lumpectomy. And I know that sort of added in a little bit of difficulty later on when they came to analyse the results, because that might have also had an influence on the body image scores other than just the tattoos, but they do recognise that, and I think it was important to include those patients as well as the just limiting it to one particular group. So I thought the sort of the sample, you know, that it was inclusive as much as it could be within their region.
I think we obviously did a sample size calculation, but I still just felt that the amount was very small for a large centre in London. I think the population of breast cancer patients that would be coming through mastectomy and lumpectomy, I thought we could probably use a larger sample size, but obviously we'd done the calculations.
I think that was I think that's a good point, because it was actually based on error, wasn't it? It was about the power they would need to look at this for a significant difference when they were looking at the interfraction error, and perhaps a larger sample might have given them a greater level of scope for analysis from the body image perspective. With the it's a more variable sample, isn't it, from that perspective?
I suppose that was their primary outcome.
Yes, it was.
And I think it's interesting. What they have done is they really have focused on. And what they wanted to look at was, does the UV tattoos provide the level of accuracy that is achievable with dark tattoos, which is, I think it's 2.8 millimetres is the random error that they were looking at. So that's what it's based on. I mean, to be fair, they did, I think what's interesting, they did recruit quite quickly in terms of their sample size, so their total sample size is, I think, 46 or something. And they managed to recruit that within 4 months, which to me says that actually they didn't have a problem with recruitment, in that women were clearly happy to volunteer to try something that's very novel and not been used before, and really we don't really know what the long-term side effects are, so it's clearly needed, maybe is the word I'm looking for, in terms of they didn't have problems getting people to be recruited.
I think I might have missed it from the article as well, but I think it's interesting that how, like you say, how quickly they did recruit, because I'm just wondering whether that it then influenced how quickly the data was then gathered over what was perhaps a relatively short period of time. And then when you're looking at things like radiographer satisfaction and essentially acceptability of that new technique, it perhaps wasn't surprising that they judged the UV tattoos slightly less favourably, and that's not to say that wouldn't change over time. And
I agree. I think
over a longer, it would be interesting to see that in a follow-up study to see if that changed really.
Yeah, because there is an element of when you introduce something new and change, it is always more difficult because it's not familiar. So I wasn't particularly surprised about the radiographer satisfaction, and you're always much happier with what you're familiar with, aren't you? So it would be interesting, I think, to see over time whether that would change.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts about the method?
Obviously we've got the non-blinded element to it. I don't know whether there'd be another way of doing it. I would presume back with the images, that we're not going to be able to see, whether it's a tattoo or a UV tattoo.
So obviously the patients couldn't be blinded, and the radiographers that were setting up couldn't be blinded. But I agree. I wondered if there was an opportunity, or whether they did. In fact, the people who were doing the image analysis were blinded, because that would have been possible. Wouldn't it?
I completely overlooked that aspect. I thought, well, clearly it can't be blinded because you'd be obvious. But that matching of the images.
They wouldn't. Obviously, it'd have to be tallied up at some point with the more kind of on-set data about timing and everything. But I think the image reviewers could have been blinded, but it don't really state, does it?
No, it doesn't. No, I agree.
They'd used validated tools, hadn't they, for their data collection methods, or at least talked about, showed that they thought about that for those that there was already a tool for, I suppose. I just wondered about the data collection points again, because there was obviously the baseline, which was a good thing about the study, that there was a baseline measurement, and then it was it 1 and 6 months after the pre-treat. So it's essentially the end or just shortly after treatment if it's a 3-week treatment, and then so there was no sort of collection during treatment for the body image scores, and I don't know whether that would have added anything or not. I wasn't sure.
I'm
whether you would have seen a more significant difference in scores, maybe.
I suppose they also had to consider that you potentially were going to get your side effects from the radiotherapy, and that could then influence the things
that's
again.
What I wasn't sure about.
I think it'd be very difficult to get that optimum time to actually. How you decide that.
And if that sort of pattern or trend in data was even what they were particularly interested in, rather than it was more about comparing the two groups, wasn't it, rather than looking for changes over time. I
think that's interesting. I think that's one thing I probably would have liked to have seen a bit more data on is the baseline actual scores for body image. So what they reported, I think, was improvement scores, how many had improved and how many cases where it had got worse over time. But what I wasn't clear about was the actual body image scores at the start. Were they comparable, or was one group slightly higher than the other? So that if they were already starting with a poor body image, there's potentially more room for improvement, or vice versa. So I think that would have been the one bit of data I would have liked to have seen, just to see were they comparable right at the start, because that's not in their characteristics table, and just to look at those trends a bit more, because like you say, they do acknowledge, to be fair, the authors acknowledge that body image is quite highly complex, and it's not going to be just about tattoos, is it? It's about the type of surgery and all sorts of other issues are involved in that. Even those women that had lumpectomies, how good the lumpectomy is, and how big a breasted or small breasted they are, and how the impact is had on equality of size of breast and breast swelling with radiotherapy. Obviously that's going to impact their views on body image and how they feel about themselves. So it is a very difficult area, but quite an interesting finding nonetheless. And perhaps, as the authors have said, they were perhaps a little bit not sure about whether it was a chance finding. It could be a chance finding. The study wasn't powered to look in detail at body image.
That's it. It's that term, improved body image. But it's not really what the study was looking at. It was to see whether it was as accurate for setup and reproducible, and also how did the patients feel about those tattoos. And we keep on kind of focusing quite heavily on this, and like you say, it's good that it showed this, but it should, to me, it was more, does it make them feel worse? Is it something that's more psychologically damaging or upsetting, having a tattoo you can see in the daylight or not see in the daylight?
I think that's a good point, and perhaps a further follow-on study might be to do more qualitative data, because I do think it's a very complex area. In our experience of speaking to women, and Amy, you've had this experience with your study as part of our work, was patients' views are variable and they change with their experience. So if you kind of explain to a patient that you're going to give them a tattoo, they might be abhorrent to it. But then when they get it, they might think, oh, it's nothing. But equally, you might explain to a patient, I'm going to give you a tattoo, and think, oh, that's nothing, it's tiny. And then when they get it, they absolutely hate it. So it is a complex thing to try and document and measure quantitatively. And I do think there might be some value in some qualitative evaluation in this area about patient experience. And again, from an outside perspective, it seems like making a big deal of something that's quite small, but at the same time we don't really understand what patients' experiences really are, and just going from sort of talking to a colleague who's recently had radiotherapy and had tattoos, who really doesn't like her tattoo now, and finds it upsetting. I do think it is a valuable area to investigate, really. I've spoken too much. I'm going to let you speak now. Does anybody?
I like the fact that they've included the additional training that the radiographers had on both the tattoo positioning and using that handheld device to locate the tattoo. I think I had to read it a couple of times to work out the process of how they were actually. I didn't realise on the first read that they were finding the tattoo and then highlighting it. Because at one stage I did think, how are they going to be positioning these patients with one in a hand and the other on the patient? I thought that's going to be quite interesting.
And I wonder if that's what increases the setup time ever so slightly. It's a very small setup time, isn't it? Yeah. I think personally that it's kind of insignificant, but I'm sure
I suppose we'd have to consider the number of breast patients there are, though.
And there are, you're right. And I do get into trouble with this a lot, because I know obviously departments have got to get patients through the door on waiting lists, and for example, if you've got lots of breast patients on one unit, 1 minute per patient can at the end of the day add up to a lot of it's one less patient almost, quite often, or more per day. And it's not, so it isn't insignificant to think about it in that respect, but I do worry sometimes that as a result of that, breast patients though are unfortunate in that respect, because there's a lot of them. Every time we make an improvement technologically wise, so with breath hold and techniques such as like this, people say, well, we can't do it because there's too many of them. And somehow for me that feels a little unfair. If they were in a group where it was a rare cancer, then people would be less likely to say that.
And who's to say that they weren't going to be, when I say problematic, I mean is in the set-up patients anyway. They might be ones that would take a minute longer because I
was just going to say that.
So
there's no direct comparison.
There's equally other factors that would have affected satisfaction other than just but they might have linked their sort of feelings of satisfaction with that technique to the change in technique, rather than was it just the time of day? Were they behind time? Was there the added pressures on that were making that additional and you aspect to the technique sort of
And you can see from the timings data that even in the traditional tattooing group, there were obviously the odd patients where it took a long time because there were setup problems. So that happens, doesn't it? But I suppose on average, it was taking a minute.
It would be interesting to know, because like you say, towards that extra minute doesn't seem necessarily clinically significant, although it has the potential to be if that was for every single patient. But whether the radiographers actually perceived that there was that difference themselves, or were they thinking it was taking longer than that extra minute?
And I wonder if that adds pressure to them. You know, the
Yeah.
feeling of that we've taken a minute extra than the
Yeah.
time allocated, and that adds pressure. Doesn't
Or
it?
if someone said, well, it only wasn't a minute extra, some
Yeah.
think, oh, was that all? You know, I thought it was longer than that.
It'd have been
So-
interesting also to see what timings were allocated for each patient, because that's obviously going to have a...
Yeah.
If you know that it's going to potentially take longer, you could make your appointment time longer, which means you're not essentially going to have as much pressure on you, if that...
Yeah.
Is that relevant though to the staff's level of training and regularity of doing it?
Well, when you look at certain aspects of the job, if you've got so many minutes to do it, you tend to use that time. So I'm not sure, would be my honest.
Yeah, and it could be. It could be that the time, it's a bit like with voluntary breath hold, as people have got more experience of doing it, the timings have come down. So it's possible as people get used to doing it and using the torch and marking, and it might come down. So maybe we should just wait and see.
Because there was only, 23 patients? So
it's not a big learning curve.
It doesn't give you a long time to get kind of hands-on and
I didn't know how many
comfortable with
radiographers were within that
Yeah,
group. I don't know if I missed
over
that.
what period of time?
Yeah.
There was also one other thing that I didn't ascertain from it, was the size of the tattoos that they were getting with the UV ink. Is that because with dark tattoos we get the problem of them either being too small and sometimes they're really too large for the patient? Didn't ascertain that from the study at all, and if that created more difficulty for the radiographers to pick up.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
That's a very good point. And I know anecdotally from other centres that have tried using UVs that they weren't able to see them very well because they were too small. And I know that in this study they did talk about the size of the needle. It was an optimum size. And I wonder if they do have to go for a slightly bigger. I'm not sure, but that would be worth knowing if you were going to implement this technique, wouldn't it? But obviously they got it down to the optimum size. They could obviously see them because obviously the accuracy was very good. It was very good actually. I thought the reproducibility data was very good. So that's obviously the optimum size. And I think what's interesting as well is because they did look at, they've got 6-month data now, and obviously because it's not been used before, initially your initial concern, my concern would be, what if there are any long-term things that we don't know about? Because again on the internet there is some talk about cosmetic UV tattoos actually starting to show in normal ambient light conditions after a period of time, and they said that hadn't happened, which is really positive, isn't it? I suppose my other slight negative thing about UV tattoos is obviously they're not visible during normal daylight, but you go anywhere where there's a bar with a particular lighting conditions, they will become visible. Maybe that's a minor thing to bear, and I'm sure patients would still prefer that over having a physically visible tattoo. Is there anything else that we haven't covered?
I was just going to say about the use of the electronic portal imaging as a method. Just from the work that we've done before, it was quite problematic, the work we did, to see the soup and the inf border, because if you've got patients that have got kind of long, quite pendulous breasts, the field of view for the image will either miss the soup or the inf. You know, they don't really report in here if we had any problems with that, if, you know, some patients we couldn't get that level of accuracy.
They don't go into massive details of they just mentioned template matching was used.
Yeah, so I just
I agree. I think a little bit more detail would have been helpful there, wouldn't it, about the matching technique. And also I did make a note of that, about whether we don't know what the range of breast sizes were, do we?
No.
So we don't know whether maybe they didn't have any big sizes, so they didn't have that problem. But it would be useful to know that, because I agree. And actually, I thought it was really interesting. Their reproducibility data was very good in that direction, in the supine forecaudiocephalic direction. It's very good. And again, from our experience, it's actually quite difficult to get that accurate and to measure accurately, because it is a little bit more variable. With tissue swelling over the treatment course and all sorts of things, it sometimes is less accurate in that direction. So I think it would be useful to have a little bit more detail, wouldn't it, about their imaging protocol that they used.
Yeah. I'd put a note about that as well, because I think when you see EPIs being used in a quite contemporary study, it's almost a bit unfamiliar now, isn't it? We're used to seeing IGRT or more sort of advanced methods. And so I had sort of queried, the method used to measure accuracy. But then I also thought that's not really what they're looking at, is it? They're not looking to give a true reflection of what the accuracy of their technique is. It's more about the comparison of the two different interventions, isn't it? They're not. So even if the measurements that they got are not necessarily they could have been more accurate in terms of saying what the accuracy was, they've still used the same comparator for those. So it's a bit difficult to get your head round sometimes, I find, but it's thinking back to what it is they're actually trying to
on the inclusion criteria, they also mentioned about having phase 2 or breast boosts. So I'm not sure if they're electron or photon, and if they are going for this accuracy, then is there any impact on if they are going for a photon phase 2 boost? Were these included? Were there any patients? It doesn't go into any of the details, does it?
I think just going back to the imaging about IGRT and EPI, actually using this type of imaging is quite standard for breast still. Some centres will cone beam them, but it's quite rare. It's still traditional to use oblique fields with as this group have done, the on-target guidance, even though the on-target guidance is getting to be a little bit old now, but it's still, I would say, most centres.
I think it's like it was more that sort of it's what becomes familiar to you when you're reading articles more, isn't it? That it's like when you I suppose going through a critique of an article, I think that's what I was trying to say. It's more like it's easy to sort of see EPI and think, oh, that must be outdated, but actually it's not necessarily the case, is it? And like you say, for this group of patients,
and I think as well it's
an appropriate technique.
I think we probably go back to what Alex mentioned about having a bit more detail about the imaging protocol and how they matched and whether they used tumour bed markers as their matching points, or whether they use the on target, because I got the impression they used the on target recommendations, which is where they outline sort of field breast and sort of lung to match to. I kind of got the impression it was that, but
they did include an image, didn't they?
Yeah.
Where you can see that they have contoured the chest wall and then.
Oh yeah.
That gives you a bit of a. The directions of UV did catch me out on there on my first read as well. Yeah, I thought, well, couldn't we have changed that?
So I think we've. If I go back to the methodology checklist, the sign checklist for those people who like to use it, I think sort of the questions that goes through is about the appropriateness of the study in terms of a clearly focused question, which I think they had. The assignment of subjects was randomised, and there was a good concealment method which they describe in terms of they had a remote allocation of randomisation through a telephone line, which is good. They weren't able to keep subjects and investigators blind because of the nature of the study, so that's
they were slightly unsure of the image.
In the imaging analysis, they do produce a table with patient characteristics to show that the treatment and the control groups are similar at the start, although I don't think that includes body image scale on it, and I think it would have been useful to see body image scores at baseline. I think they used, as Kath mentioned, very relevant outcome measures, and they used valid and reliable methods. The body image scale is a validated tool that they used. They also did they analysed on an intention to treat basis, which is recommended for randomised controlled trials. So for those people who don't know what that means, it means that say a patient was allocated to have UV tattoos, but actually they had problems with the UV tattoo and they couldn't see it, then they ended up putting a more dark tattoo on them, then they should be analysed based on the group that they were intended to be in. So they've kind of ticked all of the good criteria. The only one they couldn't really follow was this blinding. So really, I would, if I was scoring this using the SIGN checklist, I would score this study as quite high quality. And I think really what we've kind of discussed are refinements, aren't there? Things that we would have liked to have just seen as readers for understanding a bit more detail about the imaging protocol and body image scales, the actual scores at baseline. But I'm guessing, am I, from your comments, that we think this is a good study and a very valuable one, with some interesting data, particularly around body image scale, that perhaps could be used further in future studies. And I personally do think that there is some value in some more qualitative research around trying to understand patients' preferences and experiences of use of tattoos and what they mean, and getting a better understanding from that perspective. I'm just going to go around the room and just check everybody's said what they wanted to say. Have you got anything that we haven't said?
No, I think it's been covered.
Amy?
I just want to say, either way, at the end it kind of leaves us with a problem still, because it comments about patients with sub-Saharan skin.
Oh, you're right.
You know, and in the fact that they've still struggled with the UV, but they believe they would have struggled with the standard black tattoos. So obviously there's another area there that we need to be looking into.
Yeah, it's not a complete answer, is it? Yeah, that's a very good point. Alex?
No, I think we've covered it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think our conversation sort of reflects, like you say, not that it was a very good high quality study, and sort of has added to the knowledge on what influences body image, tattoos being one aspect that we need to look at more, really. And I think that's the point of a good study as well, isn't it? To promote ideas for further research as well as answer their own. There has to be a specific focus, and I think they addressed that really well.
They did. And I think, if anything, what this study has done is it offered an opportunity for choice that currently hasn't been available for some women, maybe not all, as Amy's just said, for those women with Saharans, darker skins, but definitely a choice for a lot of other women, which previously there wasn't any choice, and that's a very positive thing, and it's a good quality study as well. So we hope you've enjoyed our podcast today, and we'll be sending you another one soon.